So I now invite our first speaker to the microphone. Please welcome Dr. Maxine McCall.
Thank you, Kat. I'd like to welcome everybody here tonight. Thanks very much for coming in on a Friday night. Tonight's session of Politics in the Pub is hosted in part by Friends of CSIRO. And I'd just like to start off by telling you a little bit about Friends of CSIRO, because I know that we have some members in the audience, but we have some non-members too, and this may be the first time you've heard of Friends of CSIRO. So the information on why Friends of CSIRO was started and what its goals are all given in a graph which is on a seat near you. If you don't have access to one, don't worry, because I can talk you through it. I don't know how well that's going to come through on the video screen, but we'll just talk it through. So basically this graph is showing on the vertical axis staff numbers at CSIRO, which are either total head counts, which are the orange dots, so that includes people who are full-time or part-time employed. And then the blue dots below are full-time equivalents. So we've got the data for full-time equivalents and total head counts as a function of years from 1992 to 2017. And what you can see in that graph is that numbers pretty much are slowly declining. There are two periods where there are steep drops. One is in the 96-97 region, where there's a drop. And that was when John Howard became Prime Minister. After that, numbers stayed fairly constant with a slight decline, while John Howard was Prime Minister, followed by Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard. And then in 2013 to 2015, you can see a very sharp drop-off. And that was the period that Tony Abbott was Prime Minister. So Friends of CSIRO was formed in early 2016, basically in response to the huge cuts in jobs at CSIRO that happened over the years, over 20 years, but especially the previous 2 years. The numbers in 2015 were the lowest number of people employed at CSIRO, and they represent a 30% drop from the early 1990s. So it's a lot of scientific jobs gone. So Friends of CSIRO was formed just prior to the last election, and the focus was to stop the cuts to CSIRO, stop the job cuts, and hopefully try and increase the budget. That was the initial aim. Since 2015, you'll notice that numbers have slightly increased. Now, we don't know if that's a real increase or it's just fluctuations. I think it probably does represent a very tiny increase. So that's a nice thing to happen if it is a trend, and I guess data for this year will be very important for us. However, even if numbers are increasing, and they're certainly still a way down compared with the 1990s, there's another thing that's happening in CSIRO, and that is that when budget is cut, the projects that go first and the people who go first are those who are working on what we would call public good science, as opposed to industrially or commercially supported science. So Friends of CSIRO is very supportive also of making sure that what we'll call public good science is still done in CSIRO. It's hard to define what public good science is, because pretty much any research project will help industry and the community. But examples are things like climate science research, So just after the last election, CSIRO did cut a lot of climate science research, and on that occasion the government, in the form of Greg Hunt, who was then Minister for the Environment, stepped in and pretty much told CSIRO to reinstate some of that work. It's sort of, public good science is the sort of work where we don't want industry to financially support it for several reasons. One, industry probably is not that interested in doing that sort of work, but secondly, we the public tend to trust the results that are reported more if the work is independently financed. In other words, if it's financed by government. So in the lead up to the next election, we hope that our members will contact their local MP and communicate to our representatives, federal representatives, what we want the government to do with CSIRO. Firstly, if you decide you would like the budget to be increased, we'd like you to tell the local member. If you want CSIRO to do more public good research, we'd like you to also convey that information. Just remember, it's our taxpayers' money, our money, that's going to CSIRO, and we should have a say in how it's used. So if you'd like to sign up to Friends of CSIRO and support what we're doing, you can do so tonight. I've got a sign-up sheet. Otherwise, you can look at our website, which is friendsofcsiro.org.au, and you can join up that way. Thank you. So now I'd like to introduce Georgia Miller, Dr. Georgia Miller, and I met quite some time ago actually, when I was doing the nanosafety research at CSIRO, and she was heading the nanotechnology project with Friends of the Earth. So we had a nice interaction, and we've stayed in contact ever since. And I'm really delighted to hear what Georgia's going to say tonight, which is on the topic of the commercialisation of medical research. Is that right?
Thanks, Maxine, and thanks to Politics in the Pub and Friends of CSIRO for hosting tonight's event, and thanks to all of you for coming. So, who here used to work at CSIRO? I know there's a few. Yeah. Anyone used to study? Who's concerned about the future of Australia's National Science Agency? Yeah, pretty much all of us. Okay, yeah, so we're in good company. As Maxine says, I had quite a bit to do with CSIRO while I was a community campaigner with Friends of the Earth, and I was working on nanotechnology issues, and I really valued the work that Maxine and her team were able to do around the safety dimensions of nanomaterials and that public good research. And I'm also concerned about the erosion of funding for CSIRO's public good research. Many years ago I did my honours research with CSIRO in Central Australia on fire ecology, and the great group of people that I worked with there, their centre has been closed down as part of CSIRO's budget cuts and centralisation, and there's just this continual loss of knowledge and research that I find really troubling. And at the same time, it's not just the lawsuit and the cuts to CSIRO's programs, but also I think the continual push to focus on things that are seen to have short-term commercial application that's turning our National Science Agency more and more into a consulting establishment. And I think that there's still some great work that happens there, but we're really facing a loss of that ability to access that independent research in CSIRO that has, I think, been the source of its public support and great regard in the community. Feels like it's running out of time. So anyway, tonight I want to talk to you about how CSIRO and other medical research institutes are both facing commercialisation pressures and facing pressures from government, demands from government to focus on things that are seen to have commercial application, but also how health and medical research institutes are increasingly also active in some of these trends, in really making their claims for greater research funding contingent on the economic benefits that they can deliver and some of the complexities and dangers around that. I want to explore the commercialisation of science by looking at two key case studies. One is the Medical Research Future Fund that some of you will be aware of, familiar with, and one in CSIRO's own Medical Technologies and Pharmaceutical Roadmap. So, I want to start with a bit of a thought experiment. I want to ask you all to close your eyes, ignore the revelry from downstairs. Imagine that you are an all-powerful policy guru in the government, and that it's up to you to determine the priorities to manage Australia's public investment in health and medical research. So I want you to think about what are the top 3 priorities that you're going to use to guide Australia's management of health and medical research. Okay, open your eyes. Yes, gentlemen.
Am I a politician or am I an idealist? Because I'll give a different answer.
You could be both. Just what? Say you're an idealist. What are the three priorities you're going to use?
The 3 priorities?
Yeah.
For commercialisation. Well, for the good of the whole community, first of all. So you continue, sorry.
Yes, you're just complicating things. What about you? Yeah.
Well, I'd say that I consider the health of the people as number 1,
Yeah.
and therefore I would put research into things like trying to get steps towards finding cures for things like cancer and heart disease and various things like that. And I must say that I know that the CSIRO did some very good work in terms of getting diets which were very beneficial. They've got a number of different diets, one to do with heart, one for diabetes specifically. They connected up, they started an organisation called Reach 100, which is specifically aimed at advising you as to how you can do that by studying your genotype. So I thought.
Okay, so public health outcomes, focus on cures, and perhaps also some preventive health research around how we avoid getting sick in the first place. Okay. Yeah. Anyone else have? Yeah.
I'd add safety as one of the criteria.
Yep.
Because it's fine to have a commercial product, but if it's unsafe, then
Yep.
and safety is not really going to be a big money attractor.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah.
I got caught in sort of not being able to think, and what I was caught in was my basic position about these things. The 3 most important things are education, the discussion about STEM education is going on.
Okay. Yep. Well, look, there are a whole bunch of really interesting and important priorities for managing public funding in health and medical research, but I want to suggest that there's some others that are floating around in this space, and I'm going to come back to, that you might not have thought about as priorities that are actually shaping public policy. 1, promoting the greater clinical translation of publicly funded research. 2, promoting the commercial application of this research with a view to trying to get a better return on investment from the public investment in research. So trying to get greater commercial outcomes. 3, promoting the expansion of a local medical technologies and pharmaceutical industry sector. And finally, and this might be a surprise that this goal should be appearing in publicly funded health and medical research, but the desire for this sector to act as a vehicle or an engine of innovation that could potentially transform Australia's economy from a reliance on coal and commodities exports and mining and agriculture to one that's more knowledge-intensive, value-added export industry. And for those of you who might be sitting there thinking, why would we ask health and medical research to be driving economic transformation? That's a good question, so we'll come back to that, because the intersection between industry policy and health policy is messy. Okay, so in this talk I want to make a few key arguments. The first one is that there's a growing prominence within health and medical research policy of industrial development aids. And I think that this poses some really thorny challenges both for health and health outcomes, but also for science and how we manage science. The second is that relations between science and government and industry are being renegotiated in the context of health policy. And we're not often thinking of research policy and the management of science as a place where we have arguments about what's the role for government or what's the role for science in health, what should be the role for markets. And yet all of these kind of arguments are all happening below the surface. There are competing notions of public value in public policy at play here. So like Maxine said, answering what is public good research is a difficult question. Asking what is a public value, like a valuable outcome from public policy, is also going to come up with a bunch of different answers. And the final argument that I want to make tonight is that commercialisation pressures on research in this field are coming not only from what we might crudely call neoliberal tendencies or policies in the federal government, but they're also coming from within research, within the research sector itself, and from the research sector's champions, in which, as I said before, invitations to invest more in the field are increasingly backed up by arguments that this is a vehicle for wealth creation. And I think this last point is an important one, because if we see investment in health and medical research not only as a route to develop new health outcomes and better population health outcomes, but as a route to secure wealth, then we start asking, we should be asking questions about how we manage situations in which those objectives might be competing. And I think that's not really happening very much today. I also want to flag the great attractiveness to a lot of people of the idea that Australia should see some kind of big techno-industrial transformation of its economy. Like, a lot of people want us to be an innovation nation. We hear that all the time from all kinds of places. And what I want to do is not to say that we shouldn't be seeking that, but to ask what it means if we start pursuing those kind of goals in this area, what it means for how we think about health, what it means for how we manage our relations between science and government, science and business, and so forth. Okay, so I'm going to use a couple of key terms in my talk, and I just thought I'd be clear about how I'm using them. So when I talk about industry policy, what I mean by that is policy that's designed to stimulate activity in a particular sector of the economy. And as some of you will know, industry policy kind of went out of favour in Australia after the 1980s. Government increasingly felt like it wasn't its role to try and manage the economy to gain particular social or environmental objectives. And what we see now is a real focus on innovation policy, but I would say often it's trying to achieve those ends. But rather than government actually trying to directly intervene to promote commercial capability development, for example, in particular sectors, we see a whole lot of emphasis on trying to get the settings right that will encourage particular industries to develop. So regulatory interventions and other kinds of efforts to join up parts of research and industry, but also a big focus on pushing publicly funded researchers to do research that's more commercially relevant. And I think this is a bit of a problem sometimes. Some people describe it as asking the tail to wag the dog, saying, well, Australia needs industrial transformation, so we should ask publicly funded researchers to do that heavy lifting, rather than, for example, asking why industry investment in research is so low. There's a bunch of really thorny questions here that are related to the main focus of my talk, which is the continual ask from government to researchers to do more work that's commercially relevant. When I talk about research, often in this space we mean science, but to some extent we're talking about social science as well, particularly around some of the preventive health research. It's about social behaviours, and there are questions that go beyond science. When I talk about research policy, I'm talking about policy designed to manage that research investment, including around how we make decisions about what kind of funding should go to which areas of research endeavour. Okay, so who remembers the 2014 debate about the Medical Research Future Fund? Yeah? What do you remember about it?
Was it going to be a good thing? How was the money going to be spent? Who's going to get it? And how is it going to be regulated? And what impact or what influence would the industry have on what was funded?
Yeah, good sum up. Yeah. So when government announced this, it was touted as the single largest investment in medical research ever made in this country. That's kind of true, in that it's designed to be a $20 billion perpetual endowment fund, meaning that it's designed to be a fund in which it accumulates $20 billion, and then each year the interest earnings will be made available for research. So if it does become fully funded, it certainly will be one of the biggest endowment funds of its kind. The purpose of the fund, as Slady alluded to, was the focus of some controversy, but it's clearly designed to focus not just on supporting medical research, but also and particularly medical innovation. So supporting things that have the prospect to be commercial, to be translated commercially. It's intended to be fully funded by government through savings in the wider health budget. And I'm going to come back to this because this has been one of the major sources of controversy around the MRFF. Initially, the GP co-payment, does anyone remember the debate about that? Yeah. So that was initially conceived of as a major funding stream for the MRFF, but as we know, there was a big pushback to the GP co-payment. It didn't go through. So as a result, the fund is now reliant entirely on cuts elsewhere in the wider health budget. So this isn't new money. It's not that government is making a new fund with new money for research. It's that money's being economised, saved elsewhere in the health budget from things like primary care, hospital funding, or preventive and public health programs, and being directed to the fund for research. So $6.7 billion has been transferred so far, and with interest earnings, the fund now totals just over $7 billion. So once fully funded, which perhaps will happen in 2024-25, the Medical Research Future Fund's envisaged to provide about $1 billion annually for health and medical research, which would more than double Australia's current funding through the NHMRC for health and medical research. So it's a huge boost to research funding. And I'm going to come back in a moment to discuss some more of the concerns around how it's set up and how it makes decisions about what kinds of funding might be supported. But first I want to just give you a brief overview of its aims and objectives and how it's designed to work. So the aim of the MRFF is through strategic investment to transform health and medical research and innovation to improve lives, build the economy and contribute to health system sustainability. So we see here a very clear articulation of the goals that are going to drive the fund as being about securing health outcomes, economic transformation, but also health system sustainability, that is lowering costs in the provision of healthcare. Similarly, the objectives, the first objective is to create health and economic benefits from research discoveries and innovation. So the fund is trying to pursue multiple objectives at the same time. In order to do that, it aims, unlike the National Health and Medical Research Council, which allocates funding based on peer review and is largely, although not all, investigator driven. So if you want to do research in a field, you put in a grant, it gets assessed by your peers. You know, if you're successful, you get your funding. The MRFF works quite differently. It's priority driven, so the priorities are negotiated every few years, but grant disbursement decisions are ultimately made by the Health Minister and Cabinet. So this is a really different system. There's no peer review, and ultimately decisions are made by the Health Minister and Government about who gets this funding. Moreover, the Health Ministers have been very clear that all funding must demonstrate a strong business case. So there's a real focus on commercially relevant research. The fund does fund a range of health research, but the focus is pretty clearly to support biomedical innovation. So I just want to give you some examples of the kinds of arguments that were made for the MRFF and its importance and in support of this new, quite different approach to funding health research. At a press conference, while Communications Minister Malcolm Turnbull argued that if we want to grow, if we want to remain a competitive, dynamic economy, a prosperous economy with a generous social welfare safety net, then we have to be smarter, more technologically sophisticated, more competitive. We have to move further and further up that scale of technological advancement and smarts, and that means more investment in medical research, building the technological future that will ensure the prosperity of our children and our grandchildren in the years ahead. So he was really framing this as a vehicle for his innovation vision and making the appeal, framing as a clear public good the ability for research funded by this to help lead to Australia's long-term prosperity. And this was an argument that was made also by other advocates in favour of the fund. The then CSIRO chairman, Simon McCall, who was also the lead author of a Government Commission review into support for health and medical research just prior, argued at a National Press Club address that in Australia we occasionally refer to ourselves as the clever country. With respect, we're kidding ourselves. Our mineral and energy wealth should continue for centuries, but the timing of cyclical highs in terms of volume, demand and pricing will never be within our control. The rewards that come from investing in our minds, in our abilities, in our potential are much more within our control, and an important part of that is our investment in health and medical research. So essentially Simon McCall was saying that if we really want to be a clever country, you know, the subtext being if we want to move away from Donald Horne's characterisation of Australia as a lucky country that's sort of scooted by and not relied on its own ingenuity for its wealth, then we need to start investing in knowledge-intensive sectors, and that health and medical research offered a great opportunity to do that. The president of the Australian Association of Medical Research Institutes made a very similar argument in blunter terms. This is a way for us to be a smart nation for generations to come. We can only dig minerals out of the ground, out of the earth for so long. We need to build a smarter economy, and medical research helps us to do that while also improving the lives and livelihoods of all Australians. So I want to suggest to you that in these statements we see public good in health and medical research policy no longer conceived of solely or even primarily in terms of health outcomes. Instead, we're seeing a competitive local medical technologies and pharmaceutical sector itself presented as a public good. An important part of that is the underlying hope that medical research will be the way that Australia transforms from lucky country to clever country. And even though this hope, I think, is actually shared quite widely and has a lot of appeal, I think that it has obscured from attention some important tensions and problems that the model of the MRFF introduces. And I'm going to cluster those problems in a couple of key bundles. The first is in relation to health, because even though, as I said to you before, the objectives of the MRFF are to link health and economic outcomes, I think in practice we're seeing health objectives being eclipsed by industry development objectives. And I think the funding redistribution from primary and preventive healthcare that's happening now toward biomedical research is really significant, particularly when we consider that $6.7 billion has been transferred there so far. Because ultimately you're talking about different groups who stand to benefit from that funding redistribution. On the one hand, there's sick people now who need healthcare, and we know that poorer people are overwhelmingly more dependent on public provision of healthcare than wealthier people. So they're people in the here and now. And we're redistributing the funding in the hope that this will support new cures and new treatments further down the track, and that will deliver value for the economy, but also for people who can access those cures. But they're a different group of people, and it's a speculative hope. I think what we see here is the real some real distributive questions around whether taking funding from healthcare today and putting it into research in the hope that cures and economic outcomes will come tomorrow can really be justified. The other thing that we see is the promotion of commercially relevant biomedical science at the expense of other forms of healthcare that are not seen to have a direct commercial application. And this ironically includes things like preventive and public health provision that health economists tell us can actually end up saving money in terms of keeping people out of hospitals and preventing them from getting sick in the first place. But also I think there's some key issues here for the scientific process. The abandonment by the MRFF of peer review and grant assessment is really significant. The fact that the decision making is going to be made by politicians leaves the process quite vulnerable to politicisation necessarily. In fact, the former CEO of the NHMRC cautioned that the risk for government and the community is that the inevitable lobbying by vested interests and special pleading will dilute the value of the funds, observing that vested interests are already circling like sharks. And I know when I talk to medical researchers in this space, while everyone was really enthusiastic about the prospect of new funding, there's increasingly questions around, how will decision be made? Will it just be the better connected researchers from the more prestigious institutes who are going to have their research funded? What about the very deserving but perhaps less visible researchers from elsewhere? And I think there are bigger questions to ask too about how researchers will respond to the perceived availability of funding in line with particular political preferences to reshape their research. There's a whole bunch of questions that we can ask here. So at the same time that the MRFF was launched, there was an effort by government to connect it to other commercialisation efforts. The first major funding that came from the MRFF was $250 million that was used to establish a for-profit, public-private, $500 million biomedical translation fund. And following the MRFF's announcement, the Abbott government also created 5 new industry growth centres, including MTP Connect, MTP being Medical Technologies and Pharmaceuticals. The MTP Connect released a sector competitiveness plan, and the CSIRO worked very closely with it to develop its own roadmap. And I'm just going to talk briefly about the roadmap. I think the roadmap in many ways really showcases the shift at CSIRO to try and focus on industry-led work and points to the marginalisation of what we might consider public good research in areas that are demonstrably of public interest, like health. So in the roadmap, which was released last year, Larry Marshall says, our strategy 2020 sets out a vision to be Australia's innovation catalyst, which will help CSIRO work closely with the sector to deliver significant growth by translating world-class science and research to improve the well-being of lives all over the world. So that's good, there's an aspiration there to have health impact. But he goes on to say, customer first is the first pillar of our strategy, and we've prioritised the way we work side by side with our customers and partners to tackle the big challenges facing their industries. We're committed to responding with agility and creativity to find the right solutions for unique projects and spending more time understanding the specific requirements of industries and businesses. The customer-centric approach doesn't just extend to how we work with our partners, it's also reflected in our broader research agenda. And then you realise the customers he's talking about aren't patients. It's not the public, it's business partners. And in the body of the research, that's also made very clear. The authors of the research stress that the development of the roadmap was industry-led. And this in turn shapes its objectives. They say the ultimate beneficiary of new MTP solutions, so medical technologies and pharmaceuticals, is the patient, which is implicit to this roadmap. However, in line with the objective of MTP Connect, the roadmap is delivered through a lens which primarily considers the economic potential and competitive positioning of Australian MTP businesses. With that in mind, the roadmap aims to support the development of Australia's MTP sector by identifying growth opportunities for the sector. For each opportunity, the roadmap provides key science and technology enablers and identifies business and ecosystem actions that need to be undertaken in order to realise the opportunity. So essentially what the roadmap is doing is making a whole bunch of recommendations for how research undertaken at CSIRO can complement what it sees as industry development objectives, but also making a series of recommendations for policy and government action to improve the business ecosystem. It says, when effective, this ecosystem should provide Australian MTP businesses with a global competitive advantage. There's no attention to health objectives in the roadmap at all. And indeed, in the web statement it released when the report was launched, CSIRO says that positive health outcomes will be a flow-on effect from a thriving MTP industry. And I suggest what we're seeing here is trickle-down theory. Health outcomes are going to trickle down from our investment in commercially relevant research in this area. And what's perhaps even worse is that some of the actions that the report recommends to help improve the business ecosystem, insofar as they recommend speeding up or streamlining regulatory approvals processes for new medicines and medical technologies and devices, could be seen themselves to potentially compromise health objectives. I think in CSIRO's approach to the MTP sector, in the roadmap at least, we see a strong focus on commercially relevant science, recommendations for government to manage regulatory settings and public funding opportunities to maximise commercial prospects, no attention to health outcomes and how they may or may not be served through a focus on high-tech medical technologies and pharmaceuticals rather than other avenues or kinds of healthcare, and a complete marginalisation of consideration of things like preventive health opportunities or different kinds of primary interventions. So just in summing up, CSIRO isn't alone here. This is happening everywhere, but the health and medical research sector, I think, is a real showcase for the tensions that come into play when we pursue industry development objectives through other kinds of health policy. And for those of us like myself who think that government should have a role to play in trying to develop new industry opportunities in areas that offer, social or environmental desirable outcomes, I think we need to be careful of, damning all industry and innovation policy, but we also need to be really wary of managing the interface between industry and innovation policy, health policy, and research policy in our management of science. Because ultimately, at stake here are some really important questions, particularly in the health space, about how we value health outcomes and whether or not these are being completely sidelined by commercial objectives and industry and development goals. But there's also questions around how we might consider notions of value in public policy and whose interests public policy should be designed to serve. I do think there's some really thorny questions here about the evolving relationship between science, government and business, and how publicly funded research plays a role in that. Finally, I guess just reiterating that researchers in the medical research space, like other spaces, are not only victims of these kinds of pressures and changes, but also increasingly key voices and stakeholders in these kinds of debates. So that there's no clear-cut good guys and bad guys here. There's a lot of really, I think, big questions that go to the heart of equity, distributive justice, and also what we might want science to look like. I know that's a very wordy talk and in a very noisy environment, but hopefully that's helped show a couple of areas where these tensions are at play, and I look forward to your questions when we come back.